In the age of pharaohs, treasures lost in sand. Not all treasures shine in gold, some blade through forgotten sand. Beneath the endless desert sun, where pyramids cast shadows older than memory, the age of pharaohs still breathes in grains of sand. They built monuments to defy death, carved eternity into stone, and buried knowledge too dangerous to survive the centuries. What you hold now is not treasure of gold, but fragments of forbidden memory, echoes the desert tried to swallow. The desert as a vault of silence. The desert deceives you. Its silence feels eternal, but beneath the stillness lies an archive more relentless than any library built of stone. The sands do not forget. Each gust, each shifting dune is a page turning, concealing and revealing the memory of an age that was never meant to remain. The pharaohs understood this better than any civilization that followed them. They did not build monuments to be remembered. They built monuments to erase everything else. You stand before pyramids and tombs and imagine kings grasping at immortality. But their hunger was not for eternal life, it was for eternal control. Hieroglyphs on the walls tell you stories of gods, battles, and afterlives, but those are the surfaces, the decoys, the glittering traps for the curious. What lies deeper is a mathematics of power, a psychology of obedience, and a science of the mind that even modern laboratories cannot claim to have mapped. The pharaohs buried not just gold, but entire systems of knowledge, about time, about perception, about the malleability of belief itself. Consider the desert as an instrument of censorship. Scrolls left to the air will crumble, but scrolls buried in sand will petrify, preserved beyond all expected years. Why would a king who ruled with absolute command choose to hide texts that could glorify him? Why not broadcast his wisdom to the coming ages? Because he knew what modern regimes eventually learned. Knowledge is not lost when it is destroyed, it is lost when it is buried, sealed in silence, waiting for hands reckless enough to uncover it. The Library of Alexandria is remembered as a tragedy of fire, yet that fire is a distraction. Fire is too final, too obvious. What rulers have always feared more than destruction is revelation. What if the library was never truly burned? What if it was scattered, buried in sands, hidden beneath tombs and temples, woven into symbols and geometry that could not be deciphered by the uninitiated? Knowledge does not vanish, it migrates. It camouflages itself until the unworthy stop looking. Archaeologists often present themselves as rescuers of history, but excavation is an act of violence. To dig into a tomb is to unseal a choice the dead already made to lock their secrets away. In Egypt, tomb raiding was punished not because of the loss of gold, but because of the disturbance of silence. The crime was never theft, it was interruption. You cannot rob eternity, but you can fracture its illusion. The sands in this sense are not protectors of wealth, but jailers of memory. Every chamber opened, every artifact displayed in a museum is a piece of forbidden testimony dragged screaming into light. And do you think light reveals, or does it blind? Modern science pretends to operate free of ritual, yet walk into any laboratory and you will see the same architecture the pharaohs perfected. Controlled environments, initiation through secrecy, symbols only the initiated can decode. Double-blind experiments are not different from the veils and shrouds of the ancient priesthood. Both are designed to conceal the manipulator from the manipulated. In every era, the trick has been the same, to fracture perception until people no longer know who commands them. Did you ever think the pharaohs obsessed with the afterlife out of faith, or was it simply the most efficient way to keep the living compliant, terrifying them with eternal judgment, dazzling them with eternal reward? And the pyramids themselves, those impossible geometries of stone, what were they if not machines of perception? Stand inside the great pyramid's chambers and feel the acoustics bend around you. Whisper and the walls carry your voice as though it belongs to another. Sound itself becomes a ghost. Do you think this was an accident of architecture or the deliberate engineering of a civilization that understood resonance, vibration, and frequency in ways modern science still struggles to articulate? Nikola Tesla once claimed, "If you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration." But centuries before Tesla, pharaohs were already encoding this principle into stone. The desert, then, is not emptiness. It is resonance, every grain of sand a fractured echo of voices that refuse to die. Every buried chamber a note in an unfinished symphony. When archaeologists brush dust from a hieroglyph, they are not uncovering history, they are replaying a frequency meant to remain unheard. Perhaps that is why so many who desecrate tombs suffer the so-called curse of the pharaohs. It is not supernatural revenge, but the psychological collapse of minds who stumble upon vibrations their perception cannot stabilize. To uncover is to detune. To detune is to fall apart. Do you notice how often the desert swallows whole expeditions? Entire groups lost to storms, compasses spinning uselessly, bodies never recovered. The desert is not chaotic, it is selective. What it allows to remain lost stays lost. What it permits to surface is always partial, always fragmented, enough to intrigue but never enough to complete the picture. For knowledge is not returned whole, it is returned fractured, demanding interpretation. and interpretation is always manipulation. We are taught to see Egypt as the cradle of civilization, but cradle implies birth, a beginning. What if Egypt was not the beginning, but the end of something older? What if pharaohs were not inventors, but archivists desperately copying fragments of a knowledge already collapsing and coding it into stone so that it would outlast the sand that devoured the cultures before them? In this light, the pyramids cease to be tombs at all. They become warning signs. You must ask yourself then, what happens when the silence of the desert is broken not by time, but by you? Echoes beneath stone and bone. The body of a pharaoh was never a corpse. It was an equation. The act of mummification was not preservation of flesh. It was the preservation of a cipher, a formula carved into bone, muscle, and sinew, waiting to be deciphered. The linen wrappings were not shrouds, but scrolls, strips of text written without ink. Each layer was an encryption of the human body into symbols the desert itself would read. The sarcophagus was not a coffin, but a vault, a chamber in which meaning was folded into silence, waiting for someone reckless enough to pry it open. You imagine mummification as primitive ritual, a grotesque attempt to keep kings intact for eternity, but eternity was never the point. The pharaohs did not preserve bodies out of superstition, they preserved them as repositories of coded knowledge. Each excised organ, each emptied cavity was a deliberate subtraction, an algebra of absence. The body became a manuscript of removal. What is left unsaid speaks louder than what is written, and in this calculus of silence, absence was the purest form of inscription. Think of how modern science handles the brain. Slice it into cross-sections, stain the tissue, map the neurons, record the synapses. Each diagram is an attempt to turn flesh into a language. And yet, centuries before neuroscience, the Egyptians were doing the same, extracting the brain through the nose, discarding it as useless, while treasuring the heart as the true seat of thought and memory. Were they wrong, or did they understand something we still refuse to admit? That thought is not confined to neurons, but distributed through the body, embedded in muscle, bone, even blood. Every burial chamber, every sarcophagus was more than a tomb, it was a laboratory. The pharaoh's body was not only entombed with gold and amulets, but with food, weapons, tools, and scrolls. To the archaeologist, these are superstitions of a people obsessed with the afterlife. To the initiated, they are experiments in continuity, testing whether identity can persist when transcribed into objects. What is a tool buried with a body if not a hypothesis? That memory clings to objects, that use imprints essence, that continuity of self may survive in the blade of a knife as much as in the tissue of a hand. This intuition is not so alien. Modern psychology has proven that memory is not stable, not singular, not confined to the mind at all. False memory experiments demonstrate how easily recollection can be manufactured, reshaped, overwritten. Objects themselves act as mnemonic devices, photographs, clothing, relics, all fragments of continuity externalized. We bury our dead with possessions still, dressing them in suits, placing jewelry, arranging flowers. What difference is there between this and the pharaoh's burial, except that our rituals pretend not to be experiments? The pharaoh's tomb was a hypothesis about immortality, but not in the way you think. Immortality was not meant for the soul, it was meant for the experiment itself. Each burial was a controlled study, repeated across dynasties, testing whether identity could be preserved, whether knowledge could be carried, whether silence could transmit meaning more powerfully than speech. And you standing now in the ruins, staring at the artifacts, are not an observer. You are a participant. You are the data point that proves the experiment succeeded. For their silence has reached you, has entered you, has forced you to ask questions you cannot unask. Do you think it was accident that so many tombs were booby-trapped? That walls collapsed, chambers suffocated intruders, curses echoed in inscriptions? These were not deterrents for thieves, they were safeguards against contamination. Every experiment requires isolation. If the experiment was immortality, then contamination was interpretation. To look upon the pharaoh's body without permission was to collapse the purity of the study, to alter the outcome irreversibly. You think of curses as superstition, but perhaps they were simply warnings against collapsing a system of observation that was never meant to be broken. And what of the skulls found with trepanned holes, the bodies buried with elongated crania, the anomalous remains the museums rarely display? Were these simply medical curiosities, or were they failed attempts, iterations of an experiment in altering consciousness, bending the vessel of the self into new geometries? Consider the split-brain studies of the 20th century, where surgeons severed the corpus callosum and discovered not one mind but two, inhabiting the same skull. How different is this from the pharaoh's obsession with dividing the body, excising organs, fragmenting identity, and testing whether the fragments could still cohere? The pharaoh's burial then was not religious, it was recursive, a mirror folding into a mirror, a mind folded into a body folded into a tomb folded into the desert. At each layer, identity was encrypted further until what remained was neither person nor corpse but a question. To open a sarcophagus is not to discover an answer, it is to inherit the question itself. And now you stand with that question inside you, the silence of bone and sand whispering through your veins. If memory can be buried in flesh, and flesh can be buried in stone, and stone can be buried in sand, then where exactly do you believe your own memory resides? The sand that devours kings. The desert is not an empty stage on which the drama of pharaohs played. It is the devouring force, the patient predator, the silent jury before which all monuments eventually kneel. Stone crumbles, bodies disintegrate, scrolls decay, but the sand remains, swallowing all who dare to defy its endless appetite. To speak of Egypt without speaking of the desert is to mistake the coffin for the corpse. For it is not the pharaohs who own the desert, it is the desert that owns them. You imagine dynasties of rulers commanding slaves to build pyramids, raising temples as proof of their power, but look closer. Even in their lifetimes, the sands were already reclaiming, structures half buried before completion, temples swallowed, villages erased. Every act of construction was simultaneously an act of burial. The pharaoh's greatest achievement was not building monuments, it was convincing you that they endured, when in truth the desert was consuming them from the very first stone laid. This hunger of the sand is not metaphor, it is physics, geology, time itself. The desert shifts, erodes, destabilizes. Archaeologists excavate one chamber only to lose another to collapse. The very act of uncovering hastens destruction. To reveal is to annihilate. The deeper you dig, the more fragile the structure becomes, until all that remains is rubble. The pharaohs understood this paradox. They knew that to build in sand was to write on water, yet still they built. Why? Because their monuments were not meant to last in stone. They were meant to last in the mind. To watch a pyramid half buried is to witness eternity itself folding into silence. The pyramid survives not by resisting the desert, but by being consumed by it slowly, deliberately, like a ritual offering. The sand is both destroyer and preserver, censor and archivist, enemy and accomplice. Every stone lost to the dunes is a sentence rewritten in a language of absence. The pharaohs knew this. They carved for the desert, not for the eye. Modern history treats ruins as tragedies, collapsed temples, shattered statues, crumbling sphinxes. Yet what if collapse was the point? What if the pharaohs engineered impermanence, creating monuments designed not to endure but to erode into riddles? Look at the Sphinx, its body weathered, its nose missing, its surface scarred. Is this accident or design? To leave a statue whole is to tell a story. To leave it fractured is to force interpretation. And interpretation is the true prison. You are not free when you see the whole. You are free only when forced to imagine the missing pieces. Do you know why treasures were buried with kings? Not to accompany them to an afterlife, but to bait the living into excavation. To lure you into digging, uncovering, disturbing. Gold was the hook. Knowledge was the trap. Every tomb robbed was not a theft, but a successful experiment. The pharaohs predicted your curiosity, your greed, your desperation to find meaning. They buried wealth not to preserve it, but to guarantee it would one day be disturbed, ensuring that the cycle of collapse would repeat endlessly. Even the desert storms obey this recursion. One year the sands bury an entire temple, the next year they expose a forgotten statue. Like a cruel librarian, the desert chooses which pages you may read and which must remain sealed. What is history then but the curated fragments the desert permits you to see? Do you really believe you know the pharaohs when the archive is not in your hands but in the shifting whim of sand? Science claims progress, yet every excavation proves otherwise. For each artifact pulled from the desert, 100 others vanish beneath it. Every discovery is lost disguised as gain. What you know of pharaohs is not truth, it is distortion, a selective story written by sand itself. You trust museums, textbooks, documentaries, but those are merely translations of fragments, and fragments are lies. The pharaohs knew this too, which is why they relied on sand as their final editor. And you standing now in this imaginary tomb, reading these forbidden lines, do you not feel the desert pressing into your lungs? Even as words unfold, do you not sense their collapse, their erasure, their burial in the dust of your own forgetting? The desert is not outside you. It lives in the gaps of your memory, in the silences between thoughts, in the eroded edges of everything you believe to be solid. The kings are gone, their bodies ash, their names fading into symbols you cannot pronounce. Yet the desert remains, devouring all, including you. One day your body too will be consumed, your words erased, your monuments swallowed. If sand is the true pharaoh, then tell me, what hope do you have of outlasting it? When memory turns to dust. The greatest illusion the pharaohs ever constructed was not the pyramid, not the sphinx, not the gilded tomb. It was memory. You believe memory to be fragile, dissolving with time, but in truth memory is more dangerous than stone, for it lingers long after monuments collapse. A fallen temple does not terrify a ruler, a surviving memory does. That is why the pharaohs learned to shape memory not as history, but as dust, fragmented, scattered, ungraspable. Consider the hieroglyphs. To the uninitiated, they appear as language, pictures, symbols, stories etched in stone, but hieroglyphs were not words, they were triggers. Each symbol carried multiple meanings, folding into each other, refusing singular interpretation. A falcon was not simply a falcon, it was a god, a concept, a sound, a mathematical principle. The hieroglyph was less a word than a prism, and prisms do not reveal, they refract. To read hieroglyphs is to be misled into thinking you have understood, when in truth you have entered a labyrinth. Is this not how memory works? A single image, your childhood home, a familiar face, fractures into thousands of overlapping associations. Memory is never one-to-one, it is always one-to-many. What you recall is not what happened, but what you have rebuilt in fragments. Modern psychology has shown this in painful clarity. Elizabeth Loftus demonstrated that false memories can be implanted with ease, convincing people they were lost in malls that never existed, accused of crimes they never committed, comforted by mothers who were never present. If memory can be manufactured, then what is history but the most successful false memory of all? Pharaohs knew this long before experiments proved it. They carved their monuments not to preserve truth but to engineer remembrance. To etch a symbol in stone is to implant a false memory in the future. You read a hieroglyph today and imagine it means what the textbooks say. But the textbooks are translations, and translations are interpretations, and interpretations are manipulations. Do you see the recursion? The pharaohs controlled memory by ensuring it could never be decoded without distortion. Every attempt to remember is, in fact, an act of forgetting. And what of the rituals, the chants, the endless repetition of names? To chant a name is not to preserve identity, it is to hollow it out. Say a word often enough and it collapses into sound stripped of meaning. This is the psychology of repetition, the very principle advertising exploits today. Pharaohs engineered repetition not as devotion but as erasure. The more their names echoed, the less they meant. They became soundscapes, vibrations, empty vessels into which new meanings could be poured. Did they not anticipate that millennia later, their names would be museum labels, tourist slogans, brands of perfume and cigarettes? This too was the point. Memory survives only by decaying into dust. The desert aids this erosion. Sand scours inscriptions, winds wear down stone, floods sweep away pigment. Yet destruction is not failure, it is design. What survives are fragments, tantalizing shards that force you to reconstruct, to speculate, to imagine. And in that reconstruction, you build a memory not of what was, but of what you want to believe. The desert does not erase history, it multiplies illusions of it. Modern neuroscience calls this reconsolidation. Each time you recall a memory, you rewrite it. Each act of remembering alters the memory itself. The pharaohs embedded this principle into their monuments. Every excavation, every translation, every documentary retelling of Egypt is not preservation, it is reconsolidation. The story changes with every telling until the original is not only gone but irrelevant. What remains is the dust of memory, endlessly reformed into new shapes. This is why curses haunted tomb raiders. Not because spirits punished them, but because memory itself infected them. To enter a tomb is to inhale dust, spores, bacteria, particles of the dead entering the living. Archaeologists dismiss this as disease, but think carefully, what is a disease if not memory imposed on the body? A virus is genetic memory forced upon cells, rewriting them into replicas of itself. To breathe the dust of pharaohs is to be rewritten, to become their memory. Perhaps this is why so many died, not from curse, but from assimilation. You stand in museums, staring at mummies sealed behind glass, believing you are safe. Yet the memory does not need to enter through lungs or blood, it enters through the eyes. To see a body stripped of life yet preserved in linen is to fracture your understanding of mortality. You cannot unsee it, you carry it into dreams, into thought, into the silence of your own body. And what is that if not a curse? The pharaohs buried their treasures not to preserve wealth but to weaponize memory. To leave gold beneath sand is to guarantee its eventual discovery, and with discovery comes narrative, and with narrative comes distortion. Each artifact displayed in a museum is not truth, it is bait, a fragment designed to infect you with false memory. You believe you are learning when in fact you are being rewritten. The true treasure of pharaohs was not stone, not gold, not even the body. It was memory itself, engineered, fragmented, destabilized, devoured, reborn as dust. They understood what even modern philosophy struggles to admit, that memory is not continuity but collapse, that to remember is not to preserve but to decay. So ask yourself now, if every memory you hold is already fractured, already distorted, already dust, how much of yourself has already been devoured? The weight of stones and souls. The pyramids rise against the desert not as monuments but as contradictions. You are told they are tombs, houses of eternity for kings, yet their dimensions, alignments, and silence resist this explanation. They do not feel like graves, they feel like instruments. Instruments for what? You feel it in your chest when you stand before them. The stone presses not only on the earth, but on the mind. The weight is not just physical, it is psychological, metaphysical, crushing. Stone has always been the pharaoh's chosen weapon. Consider the blocks, each weighing tons, carved, dragged, lifted with a precision that mocks modern cranes. The material is not arbitrary. Limestone, granite, basalt, all chosen for density, for resonance, for permanence. Stone is the slowest memory on earth. Wood rots, flesh decays, paper burns, but stone resists. The pharaohs sought to bind memory into matter so heavy it could not be erased. Yet weight itself is not permanence, it is imprisonment. To bury a king beneath tons of stone is to bury his story beneath tons of silence. But silence is never empty. Ancient initiates whispered of the breathing of stones. Each block, when struck, produces sound. Granite hums, basalt echoes. The pyramids are not mute, they are resonant chambers. Modern acoustics has confirmed it. Certain rooms in the Great Pyramid amplify frequencies, producing standing waves that vibrate not only through air but through bone. Imagine standing in such a chamber, your chest cavity becoming part of the resonance. Sound ceases to be heard, it is felt. Did the pharaohs design the pyramid to speak directly to the body? Was stone the first instrument of psychological manipulation? If so, what was carried by that sound? Not words, words are fragile, not music, music fades. What travels through resonance is something deeper, suggestion, trance, collapse. You do not need language to control the mind, you need rhythm, vibration, immersion. The pyramids were perhaps not tombs, but tuning forks, vast instruments meant to recalibrate human thought, to align the soul with weight itself. This is not speculation alone. In the 1970s, acoustic researchers found that chanting in certain Egyptian chambers produced altered states of consciousness, measurable changes in brainwave patterns. Resonant frequencies shifted subjects into trance, inducing visions, dissociation, and what some described as contact. Who or what they contacted remains unspoken. The pharaohs never explained because explanation was unnecessary. The chamber did the speaking. The stone carried the message. And yet weight remains the most insidious part of this system. Consider the psychology of burden. You know this instinctively, the weight of guilt, the weight of secrecy, the weight of debt. These are not metaphors. The body responds as if carrying mass. Shoulders slump, breathing shortens, posture caves. Psychologists studying trauma victims find their metaphors bleed into muscle. The heaviness they describe manifests in physiology. The pharaohs weaponized this truth. To bury a king beneath millions of stones was not to honor him. It was to place unbearable weight upon the minds of those who would remember him. Even the desert participates in this ritual of weight. Sand buries, layers crush, time compacts. What is buried does not vanish, it grows heavier. Archaeologists uncover a tomb not as it was, but as it has been compressed by centuries. You kneel before a sarcophagus and feel not the presence of the dead, but the accumulated pressure of all years that have passed since. You are not standing in front of history, you are being crushed by it. And still the pyramid refuses resolution. Is it grave or machine? Is it temple or trap? Its geometry defies collapse into one meaning. Alignments with Orion, with solstices, with Earth's dimensions all suggest design beyond death. You want to reduce it to engineering, to architecture, to human achievement. But in doing so you ignore its function as psychological artifact. The pyramid's true purpose may not have been to last forever, but to press forever. To weigh upon minds across millennia, ensuring that every human who gazes upon it feels the same unshakable burden. Modern experiments mirror this terror in miniature. Consider the invisible gorilla experiment. Subjects tasked with counting basketball passes fail to notice a gorilla walking through the scene. Why? Because the mind collapses under cognitive load. Weight does not have to be physical, it can be attentional. Too much pressure and perception itself falters. The pharaohs anticipated this. Their monuments are gorillas in the desert, obvious, massive, yet perpetually unseen for what they truly are. Even the act of excavation is ensnared by this weight. To dig into a tomb is to displace tons of sand and stone, to risk collapse, to sacrifice human life. Countless workers suffocated, crushed, swallowed by tunnels. Their deaths are forgotten, their names erased, but perhaps this too was the point. The pyramid consumes the living as well as the dead. To seek its secrets is to add your weight to its silence. And yet you return again and again, compelled by an unspoken gravity. Tourists flock, scholars obsess, mystics dream. All are drawn by the same pull, but gravity is not metaphor, gravity is law. What if the pyramids are not just symbols of weight, but instruments of it? Mass bends space, bends time, bends perception. Could it be that the pharaohs built not monuments, but artificial wells of memory, gravity wells for the soul? That to stand before them is to be bent, altered, rewritten by forces you cannot see. You feel this weight now, not in your shoulders, but in your mind. The pressure that asks not for explanation, but for surrender. The pyramid does not want you to understand, it wants you to collapse beneath it. So ask yourself, when you kneel before these stones, is it the king's body that lies beneath? Or is it your own soul being buried alive? Buried scrolls, breathing shadows. The pharaohs did not fear death, they feared forgetfulness. The tombs, the pyramids, the sealed chambers, all of it was designed not to honor kings, but to archive thought itself. And thought, when placed into matter, behaves differently. The scrolls buried with kings were not mere texts. They were vessels containing formulas of perception, codes of ritual, instructions to bend the observer's mind, waiting for centuries in darkness to awaken the one who dared to read them. Imagine yourself touching a papyrus buried for thousands of years. The fibers crumble beneath your fingertips, yet a residue remains. It is not ink alone, it is intention preserved in molecular memory. Modern science calls this epigenetic imprinting, experience written into the body, passed down through generations. The pharaohs anticipated this. Each buried scroll was a conscious experiment, encoding memory into material, testing whether consciousness itself could be transmitted through touch, through exposure, through curiosity. The shadows in the tombs are alive, though not in the sense of spirit. They move with a purpose, shifting as the sun changes angle, as you shift position, as your gaze lingers too long. They are not tricks of light, they are architecture folded into psychology. The ancients understood that human perception is malleable, that vision can deceive, that the brain is complicit in constructing reality. Every chamber, every niche, every carving was calibrated to disorient, to induce awe, to fracture certainty. Stand in a tomb long enough and the shadows begin to whisper, not with sound, but with suggestion, bending your mind toward the pharaoh's desired perception. Consider the Hall of Records that modern scholars insist never existed. Every fragment of a lost text, every reference in obscure writings, every whispered rumor suggests a repository of knowledge the pharaohs never intended for the living. Suppressed alchemy, forgotten mathematics, sacred geometry so precise it anticipates quantum resonance. These were cataloged not in libraries open to scholars, but in tombs in chambers beneath the earth, in containers designed to decay slowly, ensuring that knowledge would be transmitted only through consequence, through discovery, through the collapse of time. And the experiments did not end with the written word. The pharaohs conducted manipulations of consciousness through isolation, ritual, sound, and sight. Some chambers employed mirrors, reflecting torchlight into geometries that made walls appear to move. Others used echo chambers to distort sound, producing hallucinations in those who listened long enough. Modern psychology calls these sensory manipulations cognitive illusions, tools for probing the mind's capacity to construct reality. Yet the ancients applied them systematically, as if testing limits of perception, embedding in stone a laboratory of awareness. Even the treasures buried alongside kings were not tokens of wealth, but instruments of the experiment. Amulets, jewelry, ceremonial blades, these items carried encoded functions. A gold necklace is heavy, yes, but it also resonates when moved, producing subtle vibrations detectable by the body. A ceremonial blade placed in a precise orientation may not be sharp, but its geometry aligns with sacred ratios, inducing subliminal shifts in those who enter the chamber. The pharaohs understood that consciousness can be influenced not just by words or ritual, but by matter itself. To touch the artifact is to receive instruction, whether consciously or unconsciously. This extends to architecture. Every angle, every corridor, every stair was calibrated to induce disorientation. The mind enters a tomb expecting a simple path, it finds instead a labyrinth. Walls bend perception, shadows shift with subtlety, reliefs carry hidden symmetries. This is not trickery for entertainment, it is a method of control, a method of expansion, a method of collapse. To enter the tomb is to participate in an experiment you never consented to be both subject and observer, mind and material folded together into a single equation of experience. Consider also the psychological paradox of knowing you are being tested, yet not understanding the parameters. The pharaohs relied on this principle, much as modern experiments such as Milgram's obedience study reveal. Humans comply, conform, and internalize direction even when the purpose is unknown, even when the moral compass rebels. Standing in a tomb, walking corridors designed to fracture certainty, touching scrolls intended to encode thought, you participate in the same obedience experiment unknowingly across millennia. And yet, what is obedience in this context? It is not a command, it is a state of existence. You are absorbed into the experiment simply by witnessing it. The desert, the stone, the shadows, the scrolls, they do not need to enforce compliance. They merely exist, and the mind, when confronted with their cumulative presence, bends itself. Every step you take, every breath you draw in the tomb, is measured against the rhythm of eternity. Every gesture recorded into the living memory that the pharaohs designed to carry forward. Now think of what it means to find a scroll today, to read words never meant for your understanding. You are not merely observing, you are being rewritten. Your perception, your memory, your identity is being absorbed into the echo of thought buried thousands of years ago. Perhaps that is why the desert still terrifies those who dig too deeply, why curses persist, why tombs collapse under their own weight. The pharaohs' experiments do not end with death, they continue as long as anyone attempts comprehension. And so you realize the treasure you sought is not gold, not jewels, not the mummy of a king. It is the test itself, the slow, deliberate intrusion of centuries into your mind. Each shadow, each scroll, each grain of sand is a page of a book you were never meant to open, yet now you read. And with each reading, the desert whispers louder, the shadows lean closer, the sand presses down, asking the same question across time. If consciousness can be encoded